I learned how thin trust really is on the edge of a cliff. That morning I sold my medical invention for $2 billion. The number felt unreal even as I said it out loud, like a measurement of distance to a place I'd never visit, years of late nights, failed prototypes, and a body that forgot what rest felt like. All of it collapsed into a single wire transfer and a few handshakes that smelled like cologne and certainty. I didn't celebrate, I exhaled. I took my family on vacation because that's what men like me are supposed to do when they finally win. A coastal place with clean air and long views, where the land falls away into the sea and sunsets look rehearsed. I told myself this was a thank you, a chance to be present, a chance to make up for time. That evening we walked out to the overlook. The wind had teeth, the kind that cuts through sweaters and leaves you awake. My wife stood a little apart, arms folded, watching the horizon like it owed her something. My daughter took photos she'd never print. My son, my boy, came to my side with a beer and that familiar grin, the one I used to recognize as affection. Thought you could use this, he said, handing it to me. The sun was sinking, the sky bruising purple and gold. I remember thinking how strange it was that beauty doesn't care what you've paid for it. I took a sip. I felt his hands on my back. It wasn't a shove like in the movies, no drama. No words, just pressure, sudden and sure, the kind that knows where balance lives and how to steal it. The world tipped, the sound left. I remember the sky rotating and the thought, clean and sharp. So this is how it happens. I fell. But not far. Luck isn't loud when it arrives, it doesn't announce itself. A ledge caught me 10 feet down, a narrow shelf of stone with weeds growing out of stubborn cracks. I hit hard enough to knock the breath from me, hard enough to feel something tear and something else decide to stay intact. I lay there, chest burning, fingers clawed into dirt that didn't care who I was. Above me, silhouettes gathered, shapes leaned over the edge. My family. They didn't scream, they didn't rush, they talked. I couldn't hear the words at first, just the cadence, questions, decisions. My son's voice, steady now, practical. My wife's, tight and focused. The wind carried pieces down like ash, too far no way insurance. When I tried to speak, pain cut the sound in half. When I waved, a hand appeared and disappeared from view. They had already decided what this was, a tragedy, an accident, a story they could live with. I stayed still. That was the second lesson of the day. Sometimes survival looks like silence. Time stretched, the sun finished its work and left us with cold and shadow. Eventually, someone called for help, not with urgency, but with performance. Lights arrived, ropes, voices that knew what to do and didn't care about our names. I was hauled up like cargo and laid out on the ground I'd walked on minutes earlier. My son stood back. My wife held her face in her hands, the picture of shock. My daughter cried the right way. I stared at the sky and tried to keep my breathing small. At the hospital, they told me I'd live, cracked ribs, a torn ligament, bruises that would bloom like maps. I nodded. Living had suddenly become a technical detail. They visited briefly, too briefly. There were questions about paperwork, about security, about what happens next. There was concern, carefully measured, poorly timed. When the room emptied, the silence felt honest. I asked for my lawyer, then another. By morning, the story had been drafted. Accident at a scenic overlook, shocked family, a fortunate survival. What it didn't say was what everyone in that room knew now and would never say aloud. Intent has weight, and it leaves marks even when the body survives. I changed things quietly, not in anger, in clarity. I learned that day that wealth doesn't corrupt character, it reveals it. It turns the lights on and shows you who has been living in the corners. My invention had saved lives because it was built on patience, on testing, on waiting until the work was ready. I decided my estate would do the same. Trusts, conditions, timelines that rewarded care and punished haste, protections that assumed love could fail and planned anyway. I didn't disinherit anyone. I did something worse for those who were counting on speed. I made time the gatekeeper. When I was discharged, my son hugged me with a stiffness he didn't bother hiding. My wife asked if I wanted to go home or stay somewhere quiet. I told her I needed rest. That was true. Weeks later, I returned to that cliff alone. I stood where it happened, careful now, respectful. The ledge below looked smaller than I remembered, or maybe I'd grown. I thought about the beer in my hand, about the trust I'd handed over without thinking. About how easily love borrows the language of care when money enters the room. I don't tell this story for sympathy. I tell it because people like to believe betrayal comes with a warning. It doesn't. It comes with a smile and a sunset and a drink offered like a peace treaty. Here's what I know now, and it cost me a fall to learn it. Success doesn't put you above danger, family doesn't put you beyond it, and trust, once given, should be given with a plan for what happens when it's broken. I survived because a ledge was there. Everything else I kept because I finally understood the difference between love and access, and I built my future so only one of them could reach it. I didn't confront them. That surprises people when I tell this story later. They expect rage, shouting, a hospital room reckoning where truth spills out like blood, but lying in that bed, ribs wrapped, body aching in places I didn't know could ache, I understood something instinctively. If I accused them too soon, I'd lose the only advantage I had left. They came in pairs over the next 2 days, my wife first, eyes red, voice steady, asking the kinds of questions people ask when they're trying to sound human again. My daughter followed, bringing fruit I couldn't eat and stories that went nowhere. My son came last, always last. He didn't meet my eyes. How's the pain? He asked. Manageable, I said, which was true, in more ways than one. He nodded, hands in his pockets, weight shifting from foot to foot like a man waiting for a bus he hoped wouldn't come. When he hugged me, his arms were careful, measured. Not the hug of a man relieved his father lived, but of one disappointed the story had changed. That night, after they left, I stared at the ceiling and replayed the sounds from the cliff, not the wind, not the fall, the voices, no panic, no calling my name. Just calculation, thinly disguised as shock. By morning, my lawyers were involved, quietly, efficiently. I didn't tell them about the hands on my back. I didn't have to. Intent leaves fingerprints, and money leaves records. We started with the basics. What would happen if I hadn't survived? Who benefited? How fast? Who knew what? And when? The answers came back cleaner than I expected, too clean. My son had asked questions weeks before the trip, about insurance structures, about survivorship clauses. My wife had requested copies of documents she'd never cared about before. My daughter had floated the idea of simplifying things once the deal closed. Like complexity itself was a moral failure. I had mistaken preparation for pride. That was my error. I was discharged on a Friday. They wanted to take me home. I declined, told them I needed quiet, time to heal. I watched relief flicker across my son's face before he caught himself. In the rented house overlooking the water, I began making changes, not dramatic ones, no sudden disinheritance, no scorched earth, just structure, layers, time-delayed trust that assumed people might reveal themselves when impatience crept in, clauses that rewarded care, not proximity, safeguards that didn't accuse, but observed. I didn't remove anyone, I removed access. When my son called to ask how I was feeling, I told him the truth. Clear, I said. For the first time in a long while, he didn't like that word. A week later, I stood alone near that same cliff at sunrise, careful now, respectful of edges. The ledge below looked smaller than I remembered, or maybe I'd grown more precise in my fear. I understood then that survival wasn't the miracle, clarity was, because falling taught me something success never did. People don't always want you gone because they hate you. Sometimes they just want what comes after you. People assume recovery is physical, that if the bones knit back together and the bruises fade, the danger has passed. That was never true. The real damage from the fall didn't live in my ribs or my shoulder. It lived in the space where trust used to sit, unexamined and comfortable. I didn't tell my family when I left the rental house by the water and moved somewhere quieter, a furnished place inland, anonymous, chosen by someone who understood the value of being unremarkable, the kind of place where no one knew my name and no one asked questions. I needed distance, not from the cliff, but from the faces that had leaned over it. Each morning, I woke early and walked, slowly at first, carefully. The body remembers even when the mind wants to rush. Pain has a way of teaching patience, if you let it. The afternoons were for work, not the work people imagine when they hear the word lawyers. There were no shouting matches, no threats, just documents, structures, contingencies. I sat with men and women who specialized in planning for worst-case scenarios. And I told them the truth without telling the story. Assume I misjudged the people closest to me. I said. Assume I won't get a second warning. They didn't flinch. Professionals rarely do. We talked about time as a tool, about how impatience exposes intention, about how generosity without guardrails doesn't make you kind, it makes you careless. I didn't ask how to punish anyone. I asked how to build something that would outlive my blind spots by the end of the week. My estate no longer resembled a windfall, it resembled a process, trust that unfolded slowly. Distributions tied to milestones that couldn't be rushed, oversight by people with no emotional stake in pleasing anyone, decisions that required consensus, not persuasion. Time became the gatekeeper, not blood. When it was done, I felt something close to calm, not peace. Calm is quieter than that. My son called the next evening. He tried to sound normal, asked about physical therapy, mentioned work. Paused just a beat too long before asking, "So what's the plan now?" There it was, I answered honestly. "I'm resting, thinking." Another pause. "About what?" "About what comes next," I said. He laughed lightly. "You've earned the right not to think about that for a while." I pictured his hands on my back, the certainty in them. "I think about it more now," I replied, "not less." The line went quiet. When he spoke again, his voice had shifted, still polite, but edged. "You sound different." "I am." He didn't like that answer, neither did my wife, when she came to visit a few days later. She moved through the house like a guest, touching nothing, eyes scanning corners. She asked careful questions about my health, about timelines, about whether the doctors expected a full recovery. "They do," I said. "That's good," she replied, and I watched her process what that meant. At dinner, she brought up the vacation again, called it a terrible accident, said we were lucky. I let the word lucky hang between us like smoke. Later, when she thought I was asleep, I heard her on the phone in the other room. Her voice low, controlled. I couldn't make out the words, but I recognized the tone, urgency wrapped in restraint. That night, I wrote a letter I never sent, to my son, to my wife, to my daughter, 3 versions of the same truth, softened in different ways. I tore them all up in the morning. Words would only give them something to argue with. Silence, on the other hand, has a way of forcing people to reveal themselves. Over the next month, they did. Questions came faster, suggestions followed. Subtle pressure, framed as concern, my son mentioned simplifying things more than once. My wife asked whether I'd considered keeping it all in the family. My daughter forwarded articles about estate planning with highlighted passages, as if information itself could steer me. I thanked them. I listened. I changed nothing. The first crack appeared when a routine request was denied, not rejected, just delayed by procedure. My son grew irritated. My wife grew cold. My daughter grew distant. The patience they'd praised when it benefited them thinned quickly when it became a requirement. That was when I understood the full shape of what I was building. I wasn't protecting money. I was protecting myself from the version of my family that only existed when they believed time was on their side. One evening, alone again, I stood at the window and watched the light fade from the trees. The world didn't care about my fortune or my fear. It kept moving at its own pace. And for the first time since the fall, I matched it, because clarity doesn't arrive all at once. It arrives when you stop rushing to be loved and start insisting on being safe. Money doesn't change people all at once. It presses on them, slowly, patiently, like water against a dam, and sooner or later something gives, not because the pressure is sudden, but because it's constant. By the 6th week after the fall, my recovery had become an inconvenience. That was the first sign. The calls came more frequently, but they were shorter, less warmth, more efficiency. My son stopped asking how I felt and started asking how long the doctors expected me to be limited. My wife began framing questions as logistics, travel, schedules, access. My daughter grew polite in a way that felt distant, like she was already practicing a future without me in the room. They never spoke directly about the money. They didn't have to. Concern has a sound when it's real. What I was hearing now was something else. Impatience disguised as care, the same tone I'd heard above the cliff. When they thought the story had already ended, one afternoon, my son showed up unannounced. He didn't knock, just walked in. Like he still had the right. He stood in the doorway, hands on his hips, scanning the room. "You're healing fast," he said. "Fast enough," I replied. He nodded, as if checking something off. "Good, because things are complicated right now." "Complicated how?" He sighed, sat down without waiting for an invitation. "There's uncertainty. People asking questions, partners, advisors, they don't like not knowing what comes next. And what do you want to come next? I asked. He hesitated, just long enough. I want stability, he said. For everyone, stability, the word people use when they want control without admitting it. You've already taken care of that, I said. His jaw tightened. With all due respect, Dad, you've taken care of it your way. But there's a reason families keep things simple. I looked at him then, really looked, at the lines around his eyes that hadn't been there before. At the confidence that no longer came from skill, but from expectation. Simplicity favors speed, I said, not safety. He stood abruptly. You're overthinking this. You survived an accident. That doesn't mean everyone around you is suddenly a threat. I said nothing. Silence is uncomfortable for people who rely on momentum. A few days later, my wife called with a similar conversation, just better rehearsed. She spoke about unity, about legacy, about how painful it was to feel shut out. She cried at the right moments, paused at the right ones. When that didn't move me, she changed tactics. You don't trust us anymore, she said quietly. No, I replied, I trust patterns. That ended the call. What surprised me most was my daughter. She had always been the bridge, the peacemaker, the one who understood nuance. When she asked to meet for coffee, I agreed. She arrived early, already seated, hands wrapped around a mug she hadn't touched. She didn't waste time. They're scared, she said, all of them. So am I. I replied. She looked at me, eyes searching. They think you're punishing them. I'm protecting myself. From us? I thought of the cliff, the hands, the silence, from the version of you that only appears when there's something to gain, I said. She flinched. You don't really believe that, she said. I believe what I experienced, I replied, and I believe what I'm seeing now. She left without finishing her coffee. That night, something finally snapped, not in me, in them. I received a message from my attorney before dawn. One of the trustees had been approached. Not bribed, not threatened, pressured questions. Framed as favors, urgency framed as concern. They hadn't waited, they had tried to go around me. By the time the sun came up, the structures I'd put in place had done exactly what they were designed to do. The attempt was documented, access was restricted further, oversight tightened automatically. Without emotion or accusation, I didn't need to confront anyone, the system responded for me. When my son called later that day, his voice was tight with something close to panic. There's been a misunderstanding, he said. Things are frozen. No, I replied calmly. They're working. This is getting out of hand. No, I said again. It's getting clear. He didn't speak for a long time. Finally, he said, You really think what hurt you for money? I closed my eyes. You already did, I said. You just thought I wouldn't live long enough to notice. The line went dead. That evening, I sat alone as the light faded, the house quiet in a way that felt earned. Pain still lived in my body. Loss still lived in my chest. But fear? Fear had burned itself out, because once people show you who they are under pressure, you don't have to guess anymore. You just have to decide how close you'll ever let them stand to the edge again. The strangest thing about surviving betrayal is that life doesn't pause to honor it. The sun still comes up, coffee still tastes like coffee, the body heals in its own stubborn way, knitting bone and muscle as if nothing important had been threatened at all. And yet, something fundamental shifts. Quietly, permanently, like a house settling after an earthquake. After that last call with my son, I stopped waiting for apologies, not because I didn't want them, but because I finally understood what an apology would cost them. It would require admitting intent, not just outcome, and intent is expensive when it's tied to money, comfort, and the story people tell themselves to sleep at night. Weeks passed, then months. The systems I'd built did what they were meant to do. Distribution slowed. Access required patience, decisions demanded cooperation instead of leverage. Nothing dramatic, nothing vengeful, just time, doing what time always does to people who are pretending. My wife moved out first. She said she needed space, a neutral word, harmless. She packed lightly, like someone who expected to come back once things settled. I didn't argue. I didn't ask where she was going. We hugged like acquaintances who had already said their real goodbyes in other ways. My daughter drifted next. Fewer calls, shorter messages, politeness replacing warmth. I recognized it for what it was, grief mixed with disappointment that I hadn't returned to the man who made things easy. And my son? He stayed angry. Anger is useful that way. It lets you avoid harder emotions, shame, fear, regret. He told people I'd changed, that success had made me paranoid, that the fall had shaken something loose in my head. Maybe it had. But if so, it had shaken loose the part of me that confused proximity with loyalty. I went back to the cliff one last time at the end of summer, not for closure, not for drama. Just to see it again in daylight, without pain or panic distorting the view. The ledge was still there, unremarkable, easy to miss if you weren't looking for it. I crouched and ran my hand along the rock, rough and indifferent. That small shelf had given me more than survival, it had given me clarity without negotiation. Back home, I made one final change, not to the trusts, not to the companies, to myself. I stopped trying to be understood, that urge, to explain, to justify, to make people see your heart can quietly ruin you if you let it. I let go of it. I focused instead on living in a way that didn't require translation. I returned to work, not because I needed the money, but because the work had always been honest. The invention had saved lives not because it was brilliant, but because it was careful, because I tested it until there were no shortcuts left. I decided to live the same way. One evening, months later, my son asked to meet. I agreed. We sat across from each other in a quiet restaurant. He looked older, tired in a way ambition can't fix. You really think I wanted you dead? He asked. I studied his face. The boy I'd raised was still there somewhere. But so was the man who had calculated. I think you wanted what came after, I said, and you convinced yourself the rest would sort itself out. He didn't deny it. That was answer enough. I don't hate you, I added, but I won't stand near edges with you anymore. He nodded slowly, not in agreement, in understanding. We paid our checks separately. That was the last time we spoke honestly. Now, years later, people ask me what it's like, having everything, losing my family, surviving something that should have ended differently. I tell them the truth. I didn't lose my family all at once. I lost the illusion of who I thought they were, and that illusion was far heavier than any inheritance. Hey race, what stayed with me after the fall, after the money, after the silence settled. Love without boundaries is not virtue. Trust without structure is not strength. And survival isn't luck. It's the moment you finally stop ignoring what you already know. I still watch sunsets, just not from cliffs. I still build things meant to last. And I still believe in family. But not the version that mistakes access for affection. Because the most dangerous fall isn't the one that nearly kills you. It's the one that convinces you to keep standing at the edge, hoping the hands behind you mean something different this time.